Hello and welcome back as we begin our look at the lymphatic system and its role in regulating the immune system, which when the lymphatic and the immune system work in conjunction with one another, we create a line of defense against things like viruses, bacterial infections, allergens, anything that will trigger an immune response. And so this is all coordinated through the lymphatic system and again incorporates the immune system. These series of videos that we will be going through for lecture, this is the first of 6 of those videos, and so there's a little bit more detail that we're going to be looking at as far as the regulation and the control of the immune system. And so I'm going to break this up into just a few more videos than what I normally would, just so that the information is not completely overwhelming. And so with all of that said, why don't we go ahead and get ourselves started as we start with the basics of the immune system and the lymphatic system. And so when we talk about functions of the lymphatic system, we really see 3 main functions that the lymphatic system engages in. And those three functions, as you can see, is fluid drainage, immunity, and lipid reabsorption. The first 2 are the more major or serious functions. The last one is more of a reference to the function of the lymphatic system within the digestive system. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the digestive system. But fluid drainage, and so we will be looking at the ductwork, the vessels that are associated with the lymphatic system here in a couple slides. But fluid drainage, we have these lymphatic capillaries that are kind of intertwined into all of the capillary beds, the vascular capillary beds inside of our tissue. And part of the reason for that is because inside of our tissues, there is something referred to as interstitial fluid. You can see here on the screen, I've designated interstitial fluid with IF. That's what that stands for, interstitial fluid. And this interstitial fluid bathes all of our tissue. When we look at tissue histologically, we're not seeing the interstitial fluid because it's been removed. Right? Again, it's fluid, and so once you've cut into the tissue and you section that tissue, you're going to lose the fluid. But understand that there is fluid bathing all of those tissues. In fact, that interstitial fluid is being more and more recognized as its own organ system. And so some of you may have heard of an organ system, right, or research being done on interstitial fluid, and have heard of the interstitium. The interstitium is this system of fluid that actually has the ability to respond to changes in the biochemistry within the body. In other words, the interstitial fluid, the interstitium, has the ability to actually anatomically change the composition of the fluid in response to disease. And so when an individual has cancer, there are biomarkers within the interstitium that can be detected within that. Any kind of inflammatory response, there are biomarkers in the interstitium that will detect that and can track that. Rheumatoid arthritis, there are biomarkers within the interstitium. that actually begin to change the composition and the properties of that interstitial fluid. And that's one of the key things in order to be considered an organ system. You've got to be able to respond and adapt to your environment. And we're starting to see that the interstitium does that more and more. Well, that interstitial fluid that makes up the interstitium that is bathing our tissues has to every now and then be drained. Excess fluid within the tissues will lead to inflammation and swelling. And so how do you drain that fluid without overwhelming the cardiovascular system and the capillary beds? The answer to that is lymphatic capillaries and the lymphatic ducts. And so part of the role of that lymphatic system is to drain the interstitial fluid from within the interstitium. Now, eventually, that fluid will get put back into the cardiovascular system, be brought to the kidneys, and within the kidneys, we can excrete, we can get rid of any of that excess fluid. We'll talk a little bit more about this coming up here on the next few slides. Another major role of the lymphatic system is its role in the immune system or immunity. And so we're going to learn that within the lymph nodes, as well as some other lymphatic organs such as the spleen and the thymus, we have major centers of both immune monitoring and immune development that is happening. And so we're going to get into that. That's really what the next 5 videos are going to be looking at. And then, as I already mentioned, lipid absorption. And with lipid absorption comes the absorption of lipid-soluble vitamins. Vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K from within the small intestines. Those 4 vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K, do not get reabsorbed without the presence of lipids. So your diet needs to have some fat in that. And specialized lymphatic capillaries that we call lacteal ducts go ahead and engage in that reabsorption of those vitamins as well as lipids. And so lymphatic structures, things that we need to be familiar with, when that interstitial fluid is removed from the interstitium, from surrounding that tissue, and enters into the lymphatic vessels, it is then referred to as lymph. So interstitial fluid surrounding, or I should say fluid surrounding the cells and the tissues is what we define as being interstitial fluid. It makes up the interstitium. Once that fluid transitions and gets absorbed into a lymphatic capillary or lymphatic vessel, we then refer to that fluid as being lymph. All right. And so, again, location, location, location. It matters. Right? Where something is present defines what it is. And so that fluid in the tissue is called interstitial fluid, but we remove it from the tissue and we put it into the capillaries, or the lymphatic capillaries, I should say. We then refer to that fluid as being lymph. Right? And that lymph is going to be transported through a series of vessels, right, which we define as the lymphatic vessels. We'll look at that on the next slide, but the whole purpose behind those lymphatic vessels is to transport the lymph. And lymphatic tissue is designed to monitor the lymph as well as the blood from the cardiovascular system for the presence of any kind of pathogen. And what we're going to see is there's really 3 main cell types that we need to be concerned with. T cells and B cells, which are your lymphocytes, and macrophages. And macrophages for our purpose here is going to be including both monocytes and really neutrophils. And then the lymphatic organs. And so where we find the T cells and the B cells and the macrophages, where are they stored at? And so when we talk about the lymphatic organs, we're talking about things like the thymus, we're talking about red bone marrow, we're talking about the spleen, we're talking about the lymph nodes, we're talking about MALT. M-A-L-T. Right? MALT is mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. And we talked a little bit about that in lab. So let's go ahead and take a look at the pathway that lymph is going to follow. Right? And so we can see right here, we start out with our lymphatic capillaries, and those lymphatic capillaries then lead into larger diameter lymphatic vessels that or lymphatic structures called lymphatic vessels. Those lymphatic vessels that are entering into the lymph nodes are what we call afferent lymphatic vessels. And again, these are lymphatic vessels that are entering the lymph nodes. And then the lymphatic vessels that leave the lymph nodes, that lead to the lymphatic trunks, are what we call efferent lymphatic vessels. And those efferent lymphatic vessels lead to even larger diameter vessels that we call the lymphatic or lymph trunks. And we'll look at that here. And then ultimately, the lymphatic trunks lead into the lymphatic ducts. And those lymphatic ducts are what are going to deliver the lymph back into the cardiovascular system. And so we can see the structure and the organization on this slide of the flow by which these vessels take. All right, and so here is the ends of a, hold on one second, here is the ends of a lymphatic capillary. Okay. And so here, this would be extending into the tissue. Right, this would be extending into the tissue. And you can see that surrounding that lymphatic capillary is a series of cells. This would be whatever tissue, whatever cells the tissue is, or whatever tissue the cells are within, that's what's surrounding it. Your interstitial fluid would be located here in between the spaces of our cells. And you can see that this lymphatic capillary right here is made up of specialized endothelial cells. Okay, so here's an endothelial cell. Here's an endothelial cell. Here's an endothelial cell. Right? And attached to these endothelial cells are little proteins. And the proteins have these filaments that are extending into the interstitial tissue. What we define as being anchoring filaments. And what ends up happening is, this is kind of a very simplistic physics lesson in fluid mechanics. So as interstitial fluid builds up within the interstitium, as the fluid builds up in this area, right, there's pressure that's applied on the cells. And what ends up happening is these anchoring filaments, which are attached to these cells, as the cells get compressed because fluid is filling into the space, interstitial fluid is filling around those cells, the cells become compressed and it pulls on the anchoring filaments. Well, when this cell compresses and pulls on that anchoring filament, it pulls on this protein, which is attached to this endothelial cell, and it pulls that. Well, when it pulls on this region of the endothelial cell, this pore opens up, which allows the fluid in the interstitial spaces to move from the interstitium into the capillary, into the lymphatic capillary. As the pressure decreases, your cells expand, which releases the pressure on the filaments, on the anchoring filaments, which releases the pressure on the protein, which allows the valve, or that pore, to close. And so the interstitial fluid does not move into the capillary, it stays where it is. All right. And again, as the interstitial fluid builds back up around the cell, right, this cell compresses, which pulls on the anchoring filaments, which pulls on the anchoring proteins, which opens this valve and allows the interstitial fluid to move from the interstitium into the lymphatic capillary. Pressure decreases, cell expands, releasing the pressure on the anchoring filament, releasing the pressure on the anchoring protein, and allowing this valve to close, which prevents the interstitial fluid from moving into the lymphatic capillary. So this is all driven based off of what we would define as being pressure gradients or fluid mechanics. All right. Pressure greater, valve opens, fluid flows in. Pressure decreases, valve closes, no more interstitial flows into the lymphatic capillaries. And so you can see that right down here as well in this diagram. Right? Here is a capillary bed. Right? Here's a capillary bed, and you can see surrounding that capillary bed are the lymphatic capillaries. And from the lymphatic capillaries, we go into the afferent lymphatic vessels, into the lymph nodes, into the efferent lymphatic capillaries, and we go ahead and we go into then the lymphatic trunks, the lymphatic duct, and that then feeds back into the cardiovascular system. And we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail as well. Again, here is just another view of what it is that we were already looking at. This is a lymphatic vessel. Right? This could be an afferent vessel. It could be an efferent vessel. But what is important for you to recognize here is that lining the lymphatic vessels are a series of valves. And these are one-way valves. And these valves open based off of, once again, pressure gradients. And so as the pressure here in this segment increases, it pushes on this valve, which then allows the fluid to flow into this segment, assuming this segment is empty. Right? Then the pressure is greater here. This segment here is available. There's less fluid here. So again, fluid mechanics says that pressure is going to move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So again, greater pressure here, lower pressure here. That lymph fluid is going to press on this valve, and it's going to move from this chamber to this chamber. Right? As the pressure here decreases and the pressure here increases, this valve is going to close, and then this valve will open. And so we have this continuous progress of movement of lymph from one chamber to the next, from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. I will say that muscle contraction does also play a role in the movement of lymph from one vessel chamber to the next. And this here is just simply a diagram of a lymph node. There are, as we will talk about, there's over 600 lymph nodes within the body. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through. All right, but you can see coming in, you have your afferent fibers. This here would be defined as the hilum, right? This little area of indentation, and this is where the efferent vessels are going to leave the lymph nodes. Right? And again, here you can see you've got the capsule, you've got the subcapsular space with your trabeculae. That's coming down here. So all of those things that you were learning about in the histology aspect, you can go ahead and you can see here. This is a secondary follicle. Right? Remember, it is your secondary follicles that actually contain B cells, right? Or your B cells, which is a type of lymphocyte. Right? And so this here would all be part of the cortex. This here would be part of the medulla. This is a nice diagram here because it's showing right here, you've got your lymphatic ducts right here. Right? This here would be the right lymphatic duct. Right? Your left lymphatic duct would be on this side over here. Right? And what happens is your lymphatic ducts, your right lymphatic duct, and the left lymphatic duct both go ahead and empty into the subclavian veins. And so the right lymphatic duct enters into the right subclavian vein. Your left lymphatic duct enters into or empties into your left subclavian vein. From there, they go into the superior vena cava. They make their way through the heart. They exit back into the arterial system. All right, so they're going to leave through the aorta, and they'll go down into the descending branch of the aorta and make its way to the kidneys, where excess fluid will be exchanged, or it'll make its way back down into the capillary beds, where that fluid will be returned to the interstitial to be able to go ahead and maintain interstitial fluid balance in the tissues. And so on this diagram here, you are simply looking at the areas of the body in which the right lymphatic duct drains, and that's what you're seeing over here in this area, right over here. All right, so this would be the area that is drained by the right lymphatic duct. So it drains the right jugular, which is draining the right side of the head. It's draining the subclavian area, right, which is going to include the arm, and it's going to drain the bronchomediastinal, which is the chest area as well. Right, so the right lymphatic duct is draining all of this area, while the left lymphatic duct, or what we truly define as being the thoracic duct, drains the whole rest of the body. And all of that is going to empty into the left subclavian. So we're looking at the left bronchial mediastinal, which is the left chest area. You're looking at the left jugular, which is draining the head, the left subclavian or subclavicle, which is draining the left arm. And then we've got this rather large lymph node right here in the middle of the abdominal cavity called the cisterna chyli. You can see that right here. And it is the job of the cisterna chyli to collect and monitor and move lymph from, you guessed it, the abdominal cavity, the pelvic cavity, and the lower extremities. And so all of the lymphatic fluid from the legs, from the pelvic cavity, from the abdominal cavity, from the chest, left chest, from the left arm, and the left side of the head, all of that flows through the lymphatic duct into the left subclavian vein. And this here on this diagram here, you can see that a little bit better. You can see that a little bit better here on this diagram. Again, we're looking right here is the right subclavian, and so this would be the right lymphatic duct. emptying into that. This would be the left subclavian, and so this would be here would be the thoracic duct or the left lymphatic duct right here, and that's where all of that lymph would be joining into. And so we can see that there is an interplay or a connection between the lymphatic system, the immune system, and the cardiovascular system. And so where I kind of want to end this one is setting you up for the next video, which is looking at organs of the lymphatic system. And so we've got two different sets of organs that we need to consider. We have primary lymphatic organs and we have secondary lymphatic organs. Your primary lymphatic organs are where T cells will mature and become active. And so there's really two areas where that happens: red bone marrow and the thymus. It is the job of the red bone marrow to produce both T cells and B cells, and we'll talk more about this again. And so red bone marrow produces both B cells and T cells. Both of those are types of lymphocytes. But it is the role of the thymus to actually cause T cell maturation, or it's within the thymus where our T cells mature. And so in the thymus, you won't have any B cells. You just have the presence of T cells. But both the T cells and the B cells are produced within the red bone marrow. And then you can see here the secondary organs of the lymphatic system is where we actually carry out immune response. And so your lymph nodes, your spleen, your MULT, your mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, and within the tonsils are areas where the T cells and the B cells are going to function in conjunction with neutrophils and your monocytes as well. And so I think this is a good place to stop. This gives you a lot to chew on and to kind of look over. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to give you that opportunity. You can review the questions, make sure you've got everything down in your notes. And as always, I'm available for questions. Just kind of jot them down and you can ask during class time or shoot me an email. And with that, I'll catch you on the flip side.